Hey, I'm Lucy. Did you guys know that the Chinese Spring Festival Gala has gone absolutely viral because of its robot performances? We're talking about a broadcast with 600 million viewers, roughly double the entire population of the United States watching one single show. But it wasn't just the ratings. I was watching these French tech experts on Tech & Co., and they were genuinely stunned by what they saw. One expert didn't even hold back. He literally said that when you look at China's drone and robot shows, they have 50,000 years of progress over what's currently happening in Europe.
Quand tu vois les shows de drones qui se passent en Chine, 50 000 ans d'avance sur ce qu'on vit en Europe aujourd'hui.
Et je pense qu'il doit y avoir pas mal de technologies communes.
We're seeing an army of unitary robots performing synchronized, high-stakes kung fu live with zero errors. No CGI, no tricks. Just raw, mechanical dominance. It makes you wonder, while the rest of the world is busy with endless internal debates, when did the gap get this wide? Now look at the contrast. For years, we've been told the US and companies like Boston Dynamics were the undisputed leaders of this field. But here's the reality. Being a leader in a research lab doesn't mean much when you can't scale. The French experts pointed out that while the West often has the early innovations, China is the one winning the battle in the factories. Take Unitree, for example. While Boston Dynamics is only producing a few thousand units, China is already pushing to export 20,000 humanoid robots a year. Today, 90% of global humanoid robot exports come from China. And the price? Their G1 model is hitting the market at about $16,000. In an industrial setting, that's a 6-month return on investment. Compare that to the European market, which is basically nowhere on the map for mass-produced humanoids. The West is still showing off prototypes. China is already shipping the product.
Il y aura pas mal de technologies communes entre ces drones et ce qu'on a vu là.
Mais en fait, ce qu'on est en train de revivre... Alors, parenthèse marrante, vous voyez que les robots qu'on voit à la télé, ils essaient vraiment de remettre les codes de la Chine éternelle par-dessus. C'est aussi un outil de soft power. On est en train de faire une démonstration. C'est-à-dire que tu vois, c'est le doré impérial avec le rouge de la prospérité.
C'est du marketing politique.
C'est vraiment du marketing politique. En revanche, ce qui est vrai, c'est que les Chinois dans la robotique sont en train de gagner comme ils ont gagné sur tous les marchés où ils ont essayé de se positionner comme ça. On l'a vécu pour les panneaux solaires, on l'a vécu pour les batteries, on l'a vécu pour les voitures électriques. Pour les voitures électriques, c'est... en fait, c'est pas une guerre qui se gagne. La robotique, en tout cas, ça va pas se gagner dans les labos de recherche, ça va se gagner dans les usines. C'est-à-dire qu'en fait, ils ont pas forcément les early innovations, les innovations, les premières, on les a vues plutôt côté Boston Dynamics, etc. aux États-Unis. Et comme d'habitude, les premières innovations sont en Occident. En revanche, ils arrivent à industrialiser très vite, on expliquera pourquoi, etc. Et en fait, à prendre des marchés, aujourd'hui, on voit que les robots humanoïdes, 90% des exportations mondiales, c'est la Chine. Et quand on regarde ce qu'ils veulent en sortir, on en reparlera, je crois,
20 000,
après, mais 20 000, alors que Boston Dynamics, on est à peine à quelques milliers.
Those French experts hit the nail on the head. This isn't some lucky break. It's the exact same playbook used with solar panels and electric vehicles. Actually, it's quite predictable. China doesn't just dabble in tech, it goes all in. There is an unbeatable trinity at work here. First, China is churning out 600,000 new engineers every year. Second, the supply chain is literally plugged into the ports. They own the batteries, the sensors, and the assembly lines. And third, there is the foresight to invest at any cost. While Western political systems are often tied up in election cycles or quarterly profits, China is looking 20 years ahead. The infrastructure for this robotics revolution was being built while the rest of the world was still sleeping. That's the real secret behind the rise. The future isn't just anticipated, it's manufactured. It's actually quite ironic. For decades, the narrative in the US and Europe was that China was just the world's workbench, a place for low-end manufacturing because it was cheap. The West stayed comfortable, living off the inheritance of past innovations and assuming it would always hold the high ground. But while those nations were resting on their laurels, the global landscape shifted. Now, The world is waking up to find that China has completely bypassed the low-end phase and is leading in high-end manufacturing. Those French commentators were visibly shaken because they realized Europe has been standing still. There was a long-standing myth that China couldn't innovate, only copy. Well, look at the humanoid robots now. Who's copying whom? The West is still relying on industrial advantages from 30 years ago, while China is redefining what high-tech even looks like. It's not just about labor anymore. It's about who owns the most advanced tools. And right now, those tools are being built in Shenzhen, not Silicon Valley.
De l'IA, où tout le monde commence à découvrir l'IA, ben là c'est vraiment ça en fait. Ils ont montré à 600 000 Chinois, ça y est, on est prêt.
600 millions.
600 millions, tu as complètement raison, 600 millions. On est prêt, on va déployer massivement. Et je trouve que ça c'est assez fou. Et ce qui je trouve encore un peu plus fou, c'est que les gens ne voient pas ce qui est en train d'arriver. Je ne veux pas être alarmiste, mais tu vois bien que si un robot a une dextérité aussi forte pour danser, il doit avoir une dextérité aussi forte pour faire pas mal de jobs quand même. Tu vois, donc,
il y a l'environnement maîtrisé, là, l'environnement non
oui, mais
maîtrisé
encore une fois, quand tu es dans une ligne de production, l'environnement est assez maîtrisé quand même.
Non, mais c'est vrai que...
On ne voit pas ce côté-là. C'est-à-dire qu'il y a un moment, si tu reprends les images de ce show il y a 10 ans, il n'y avait pas de robots, il n'y avait que des humains.
Think about this for a second. For decades, when people talked about cultural soft power, they were usually talking about Hollywood. It was the era of American blockbusters and the global dominance of the superhero. Characters that defined what was cool for the rest of the world. But now, China is running a very different play. They aren't just selling a piece of hardware. They're wrapping their traditional culture in the most advanced tech on the planet. On that gala stage, these robots weren't just walking. They were performing kung fu. You could see the influence of Bruce Lee's speed and Jackie Chan's choreography in their mechanical movements. It's a clever fusion. While Hollywood used to own the image of the future with sci-fi movies, China is now using actual physical tech to export its heritage. They are taking ancient symbols of eternal China and running them through high-speed processors. It's no longer just about who has the best movies. It's about who is making the future look like their own culture. Lately, there's been a lot of anxiety in the West. People are seeing AI-generated videos of Chinese robot armies, and the panic is real. But looking closely, that fear is often a symptom of insecurity. When Western nations innovate, it's celebrated as progress. When China does it, it's labeled a threat. Actually, the best way to handle competition isn't to be afraid of it. It's to match it. Instead of spending so much energy worrying about China's AI robots, there should be a focus on developing better tech and catching up. The world is big enough for multiple leaders. At the end of the day, the goal shouldn't be a robot war, but seeing how this technology can solve global problems together. That 50,000-year gap the French experts talked about doesn't have to be permanent, but it starts with admitting that the race has changed.